12 of our PMP certification training. Here we're going to be taking a look at project stakeholder management. So once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your anchor person. So the project stakeholder management was the last knowledge area that was added to the knowledge areas in PMP. Otherwise, before now, we used to have 9 knowledge areas, and then of course stakeholders was added, now making it 10 knowledge areas in all. So this basically talks about how we're going to be able to manage folks who might be interested, impacted, or involved in our project, and that's exactly what project stakeholders management here focuses on. So let's just dive in. So at the end of this particular module, you should be able to define stakeholders and then also identify different stakeholders on a project, then describe stakeholder classification models as well as stakeholder engagement assessment metrics, also list the skills needed to manage stakeholders, and then describe the project stakeholder management processes. These are some of the things we shall be discussing in this very lesson. So let's talk about stakeholders. So that stakeholder refers to an individual, group, or organization who may be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project, program, or portfolio. So a stakeholder can have a positive or a negative impact. Therefore, it is necessary to engage and involve the stakeholders in the project to ensure project success. So don't forget that your stakeholders can actually affect your project positively or negatively. And typically, any stakeholder you fail to identify and determine how to effectively manage will cause you the most headache in your project. And that's part of the reason why stakeholder management is quite necessary. So ways you can better involve your stakeholders can include: 1, by identifying them, and then secondly, determining their requirements, then determining their expectations, also determining their interests, then determining their levels of influence, also determining their levels of authority, then plan to engage the stakeholders, also plan how you will communicate with them, then manage expectations, influence and engagement, communicate with them, and then also monitor communications and stakeholder engagement. So these are examples of folks who can constitute your project stakeholders. Of course, they can include the project manager, the project team members, your senior management, your project sponsor, your customers, the end users, the vendors, then also people affected by the project output, also your competitors, your social groups, as well as government and political leadership. Don't forget, this list is not exhaustive. Otherwise, we also have other folks or groups who can actually constitute or make up your project stakeholders. So in order to enable us to analyze our stakeholders, we have what we refer to as the classification models for stakeholders. One very popular classification model is what we refer to as the stakeholder power interest grid. So the stakeholder power interest grid is basically used to analyze our stakeholders and be able to determine effectively how to manage them. So the stakeholder power interest grid has 4 quadrants, which are going to term quadrant A, quadrant B, quadrant C, and then quadrant D. So quadrant A represents stakeholders that have high power but then low interest. So they have high power in your project but then low interest in the project. These are stakeholders who fall under quadrant A. Then stakeholders who fall under quadrant B, they have both high power in the project as well as high interest, while quadrant C stakeholders have low power but then high interest. And then stakeholders who fall under quadrant D are stakeholders who have low power as well as low interest in the project. So for stakeholders who have high power and low interest in the project, PMI says for such stakeholders, you need to keep them satisfied. So this is how you manage stakeholders who have high power but low interest in your project. Then for stakeholders that have both high power and high interest in your project, you need to manage them closely. And then also stakeholders that have low power but high interest, these stakeholders need to be informed, so you need to keep them informed. And then for stakeholders that have both low power and low interest, you now need to monitor such stakeholders. So the power interest grid is one of the most popular classification models we can actually use to be able to, 1, classify our stakeholders and then also determine how best to manage our stakeholders. Aside from that, we also have what we call the stakeholder engagement assessment metrics, which for short we refer to as the SEAM. So the stakeholder engagement assessment metrics basically talks about, various classification of our stakeholders based on the level of cooperation and awareness that they have on our project. So these are various, levels of involvement of stakeholders within our project that we can have. One will have what to refer to as unaware. Unaware simply refers to stakeholders who are not aware of the project and its impact. Then we also have resistant stakeholders. These are stakeholders who is aware of the impact and then is resistant to change. That's what we refer to as resistant stakeholder. And then also we'll talk about neutral stakeholder. So neutral stakeholder is aware of the project but is neither supportive nor resistant. And that's what a neutral stakeholder refers to. Then we'll have supportive stakeholder. So supportive stakeholder is aware of the project and is supportive of the change, while leading stakeholder is aware of the project and is actively engaged to ensure the project's success. And that's what the leading stakeholder here refers to. So in the SIM metrics, that is the stakeholder engagement assessment metrics, you can see those various classification of our stakeholders. That's the unaware, the resistant, the neutral, the supportive, and then the leading. And then you can see our various stakeholders we have in this very project. So the letter C here represents the current status of the stakeholder, and the D represents the desired status of the stakeholder. So the further the C is from the D, the more work we need to do on that stakeholder. So in essence, we probably need to do more engagement with stakeholder 1 than we need to do on stakeholder 4. So that's exactly the whole idea of the SIM metrics, because you need to first of all get this stakeholder 1 to become aware, and then of course conquer resistance, then conquer neutrality before you can begin to get the stakeholder to become supportive. So that's why we say that the further the C is from the D, the more engagement you need to have with that very stakeholder. So this will help you to determine the amount of effort that you need to invest in your stakeholders to get them to become supportive, which is the most important and then of course the most desirable stage of your stakeholders engagement. In other words, to get your stakeholders to become supportive. So to enable you manage your stakeholders, there are specific set of skills that you require. Of course, one of it would include your interpersonal skills. So interpersonal skills will enable the project manager to effectively build trust, resolve conflict, and then also listen actively and overcome resistance to change. And then also you require managerial skills. Of course, this will enable you to complete or accomplish the project objectives. So ability to facilitate consensus, influence people, negotiate agreements, and then modify organizational behavior. All of these are part of what we have in the managerial skills that will enable you to effectively manage your project stakeholders. So we're in the very last knowledge area, which is project stakeholders management, and here we're going to be taking a look at 4 processes. So the 4 processes we have under project stakeholders management are: we have the identify stakeholders, we have the plan stakeholder engagement, we have the manage stakeholder engagement, and then also the monitor stakeholder engagement. So those are the 4 processes that we have under project stakeholders management. So when we come back in the next part, we're going to be taking a look at each of these processes and then also talk about their input, tools and techniques, as well as output. And that's basically what we're going to be discussing in the part 2 of our project stakeholders management. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, thank you for listening.